hasn't looked in their wardrobe and deemed it still missing one crucial piece? Well, these two exquisite late Qing dynasty ensembles have never appeared in any wardrobes because they aren't actually garments from 200 years ago.
自己做的时候发现说，其实如果是买当初就比较贵，不用做那么久，说不定也比较划算。就我们是用便宜的材料，然后我们自己用手工做，那要做很久。不过以前说不定也是这样，就如果他买不起那个贵的材料，他就是自己慢慢做，自己慢慢做的。
因为我活在那个古代里面，根本没办法生活，因为我觉得他们的工太细了，像我那么急的人，就是根本没办法，就是做好一个这样子很细的衣服，可能就没办法，好像嫁出去啊，还是怎么样啊？对。
From the vault at the Chinese Textiles and Clothing Culture Center, we have carefully selected several extant late Qing dynasty garments to examine, such as this late Qing Dajinshan. We estimate that it was in use circa 1860 to 1890. The Jin of the Dajinshan refers to the right front overlap. The overlap usually has an S-shaped curve on its top edge. Dajinshan of this era often had very wide sleeves, therefore, they are sometimes referred to as 大袖衫, meaning big-sleeved shirt. On the Jin, there is a decoration known as huayun, meaning to scoop out clouds. This is a method of cutout applique where the negative space of the fabric below is part of the design. Apart from the huayun, another form of decoration on this top is the silk ribbon trim. In total, there are 4 kinds of ribbons. The ribbons are all made of silk and are a way to flaunt wealth and fashion sense. The method of decoration used on the sleeve bands is known as duiling, literally to stack silk. Small pieces of silk are stacked together and appliqued onto the top, giving a 3D effect. This is a purple Dajinshan from the late Qing and early Republican era. We estimate that it was used circa 1900s to 1910. A big difference between this and the previous Dajinshan is the length and width of its sleeves. The sleeves on this purple Dajinshan are much narrower and longer, and the inside of the sleeve cuff is decorated, meaning that it was meant to be worn with the cuff turned back. Another notable difference is the width of the main body, with this top being much less voluminous. We can see that the silhouette is starting to become longer and narrower. As for the embellishment, this Dajinshan is more restrained, with only a few lines of self-trim down the side slits and hem. Earlier, during the 19th century, there would often be multiple rows of trim along the sides and hem, sometimes with elaborate cloud patterns and such. However, styles changed as the Qing dynasty drew to an end, so this Dajinshan is only trimmed very simply.
你要怎么量？我要动手喽。
帮我量袖口。
翻多少是不是？
如果说袖子多，袖口宽。
你要袖口宽，不是要这个宽。应该都要吧？对啊，
袖口宽比较重要。
The Dajinshan Reconstruction project is part of the Textile and Clothing Department's curriculum. At the graduate level, the department teaches 2 classes, Asian and Chinese clothing and culture, and Taiwanese clothing and culture. These courses are taught because When learning how to design, we must first amass enough cultural knowledge to know what has come before us, how it affects us now, and how our culture influences our dress. Therefore, fashion history is taught at most fashion schools, including at Furen. However, it can be hard to visualize the different types of clothing worn in the past, or to understand the different aesthetics of different eras by merely looking at pictures in a textbook. By trying our hand at reconstruction, not only can we as students get a multi-dimensional view of how the garment is made and what it looks like when worn, we can also keep alive traditional garment construction techniques that have almost been forgotten. In the Qing dynasty, women of all classes and ethnic groups wore a type of T-shaped top that opened down the right side, which is called the Dajinshan. In the 1800s in particular, the Dajinshan was ubiquitous in Taiwan and in China. The main structure was always the same. What differentiated the clothing of different cultural groups was mainly the embellishments used. In our institute, the CTCCC has a considerable number of Dajinshan, ranging from the 19th century to the mid-20th. As a testament to its popularity, Dajinshan can also be seen in museum collections of Chinese clothing all over the world.
我们这次看了有5件不同的大金衫，然后一个裤子跟一个裙子。那5件呢是包含有大概3件是1850到1890左右的大金衫，然后1件是大概1900到1910大金衫，然后1件是比较现代的原住民的大金衫。所以其他那几件比较老的，他们应该都是汉人的，然后我们推测是闽南人的衣服。
那一开始的时候，我就跟组员们讨论，就是有2个方向。那第一个可以是以时代来做切分，就是同样的大金衫，同样的族群，然后它在1850年到1910到1950，它的变化是什么？但是也可以有另外一个类型是跨族群的一个变化，也许是同样是1930年代的闽南客家原住民。那做这样一个分析的很重要一个原因，是因为它要帮助我们同学去发现问题。也就是说，同样是一件大金衫，等于说在时间的变化之下，它在整个款型变化上，因为什么样的社会、经济、文化的变化而有款式上面的变迁。那或者是说，第2个就是族群当中的文化怎么样作为一个驱动去做它自己的自由的挪用跟取舍。所以这个就会是在研究上面一个很重要的议题。
我们选了2套是选不同时期的。清末民初是一个蛮有趣的时期，就是服装上变化蛮快的，所以我们就可以看到它从很宽松啊，袖子很大的大金衫，然后在30-40年就演变成窄袖的，然后其实在过了没多久的话，其实就变成我们现在所知道的旗袍。
很多学习艺术的、设计的，还有譬如说织品服装的，那也都会希望是研究者本身具备实作的能力。那因为你透过实作的这个过程当中，可以更进一步了解所有的所谓的美感。
这你是要这种图案？
对，我想要就是这种
暗花纹的，然后但是我们的颜色想要偏淡一些，
我们想要浅蓝色或是浅绿、
浅紫，
大部分就这种。
因为
暗花的人很少，现在暗花的很少。
对啊，对。
我要单色的，所以应该是比较像零。
你说单色，
就是像这种素色吗？对对对，
是这个。
哎呀，哦，这个颜色很不错。
来，你要提花的。
对，我要提花的。
那一块蛮适合。
对啊，所以这是纯蚕丝的吗？
对。
我看一下我的那个参考的颜色。就是我们内里就买这种薄薄就可以了。因为那个紫色那套的内里是棉的。然后我记得是那种蓝，
应该也是浅显的蓝吧？
这纯棉啊，透气棉。
有哪些颜色
？10来色哦。
有没有那种淡淡的蓝色？
蓝绿色这样。
淡的蓝色。
对。
这个好像。
这个
这个很像
我觉得这可用
对啊。
这一码多少钱
？180，5尺宽，150
我觉得
这个更像，这个更像。
这个都有，你要多少都有。
只是现在现货只有这样。
没有，这个色今年很抢手，这个剪的人很多了。
请问有没有像这样子的织带？这个是大概12mm。
要一模一样的吗？
不用到一模一样啊，就是风格类似就可以。
或者是颜色。
而且两个都有一点粉，这个看起来比较
粉一些的。哦，好难哦。
对啊，
好想要选它哦。
它也是有很多织带，就是这边有一条，然后这边再一条，然后再2条小的，三条小的，把它的缝盖起来。所以这种可以买得到，这种就是比较普通的单色，只是这些有花纹的，我觉得都很有点困难。这个是5公分，5公分宽吧。
而且它这个边上的刺绣也会是一个问题。
这个刺绣的话，我们也是要机器绣，对啊。The main focus of the reconstruction of the turquoise Dajinshan is the duiling. The duiling is first sewn on the black silk bands before being attached to the main body. Here is the phoenix motif. We traced the outline of a photo of the original garment in a vector program. You can see that there are tons of little pieces, and we have to account for some distortion in the original. So this took a very long time to redraw after the individual pieces were separated from the main template. We printed out the pattern, cut out the pieces, and sorted them according to their fabric color. The pieces are cut with seam allowance, and the seam allowance is pressed in by wetting the starched silk with a brush, and then ironing it down around a cardboard template. This way it will hold its shape. Then the cardboard could be removed. The wrapped pieces are temporarily glued in place on the backing fabric. Then they are top stitched on with a tiny 1.6mm stitch length. After the silk pieces are stitched down, they need to be colored. We found that the pigments used for Chinese painting are very similar in color to the pigments used on the original. They are applied after wetting the silk in order to get the gradient effect. At first, we wanted to use an embroidery machine to make the ribbon trim, but we found that the interfacing used in the machine embroidery added too much thickness. So we bought antique 1940s silk ribbon that was manufactured in France. The 6 lines of trim are all hand-sewn onto the garment with a running stitch. The Huayun applique is stitched on with slip stitching. This is the purple Dajinshan circa 1900s to 1910s. Its main mode of embellishment is bias trim. Apart from around the hem and the collar, the sleeves and the main jin are all decorated with different widths of bias trim. The bias trim on the purple Dajinshan is first stitched down on one side by machine, then filled down by hand with slip stitches. In order to prep the bias tape, they are first starched and cut into strips. Then the edges are folded over and pressed. Only one side needs to be pressed. It will be machined on the side that isn't pressed. After stitching, it is folded and secured with a slip stitch, forming a 3 mm wide bias trim. After viewing and handling these garments, I found that there were remarkable differences in the embellishments used in each era. For example, in our turquoise Dajinshan, which is older, there is a lot of silk ribbon, and the ribbon goes around the hem as well as around the collar. I like the purple Dajinshan, which only uses bias trim and very little of it around the hem. Perhaps we can trace the evolution of fashion through how trim is used. I think this is something that can be explored in future research. The biggest challenge we encountered in this reconstruction project was how to make the duiling. There were so many tiny pieces, and each piece had curved edges. We also made a matching skirt for the Dajinshan based on an example from our museum collection. This kind of skirt is called a yulin ma mian baizhe. Every single pleat is secured from the inside at 1.5 cm intervals, making the skirt shimmer like fish scales when the wearer moves. We also discovered when we were sourcing the materials that the materials needed for the purple Dajinshan were substantially cheaper. It cost only 1/10 of what the turquoise one cost. However, it was much more difficult to construct. So it could be made on a smaller budget, but you have to make up for it in construction time. So either they had the time to sew it, or the wages of the tailor was cheaper than the price of the materials.
我没有想过会花那么多时间，还有那么多心力在那边。就怎么说，就是古代的那种服装，那是我没有想过，就是以前的人是怎么去制作的这件衣服的。
我们在做的时候，我会比较仔细的去观察它，然后我们会去发现它里面可能有一些暗藏的玄机。很多这些技术虽然没有很难，可是它很花时间。然后它的材料可能其实没有很贵，像是我们做的那堆领啊，材料就是碎布，可是它花非常多的时间。
就是你想放弃的时候，也是要继续很努力去做好那样子，做好那个成品，就是有一个成就感那样子。对。
你最后做作品的时候，是不是也要在熬夜，然后很崩溃？
对啊，我就是疯狂的打给朋友说，怎么搞的？为什么让我做那么多？ 对啊，要熬夜，我现在要熬夜了，这种不停抱怨的，怎么办？我要熬夜了。
我们中间其实在剪那个duiling的时候，因为就是剪不完，还请我们朋友来帮忙。
对，我是就是不停的跟他们说，
他房间地上就剪。
对我疯狂来我的房间，之后就是拐他们去。
然后去3个下午，3个5个小时。
对，就是一边吃午餐，吃完午餐又吃晚餐，然后就是疯狂的把它做好那样子。